Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners.
Oh, you've gone into the voice.
Want me to get that over with?
May as well.
If you'd like to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour, we would so appreciate it. Go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate, and we would urge you to consider becoming a 1776 Club member. And we would thank you immensely for it.
Indeed. And while we're at it, in the shameless Hamiltonian period of our podcast preface, these cultural tours.
Yeah, we didn't even mention that in the show this week. I can't hardly believe it.
I'm going to be in trouble,
too.
I
can't believe it.
So the first one, there are two in January at Lochsaw Lodge, west of Missoula, the most beautiful lodge. It's not a harsh winter. It's always mild and beautiful there.
Yeah, be sure to tell Russ, thanks for that first edition can we wrote.
Had to bring it up.
That he gave me and not you.
Yeah, no, believe me, I've let him know.
Okay, just want to get that in.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Russ.
You bet.
But these Lochsaw retreats, one on Water in the West, that's the 13th through the 18th of January at this really remarkable lodge. And Water in the West is an extraordinarily interesting, even fascinating topic. And then the second one is Shakespeare.
Wait, what books are you referencing?
A bunch of them, but the main book is Mark Reisner, Cadillac Desert. I don't know if you know this book.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I have 3 copies
Isn't
of it.
Isn't it great?
I read it like when it first came out, and then he updated it, and it's the best.
It reads like a novel. It's a fabulous book.
It's the best book. And even if people are unable to attend your retreat, they really should read that book.
And then the great Wallace Stegner classic, Beyond the 100th Meridian, about John Wesley Powell. Deadpool, which is about the future of the Colorado River in an age of global climate change. And The Emerald Mile, which is about all the wacky attempts people have made to go down the Colorado Canyons.
I don't know that one.
Well, it's a great book. In 1983, when we nearly lost the river, the Glen Canyon Dam was nearly overwhelmed by the highest water year.
Right, yeah.
And these two knuckleheads decided to make the record of going down the river in a wooden dory because the water was just coming out of that.
I vaguely recall this.
And they put in illegally. The river had been closed. All these raft companies and other.
Oh, you have my interest.
And so they put in, and they made it. They actually did set the record. The minute they came out at Grand Wash Cliffs at the end of the Grand Canyon, they were arrested by federal authorities because they had. It's great.
I've interrupted you, so we have 2 Lochsaw Lodge.
Right, and the first one is Water in the West, and I really urge people to come to that one. This is, as they like to say, in my wheelhouse.
And the second is
on Shakespeare Without Tears. We did Shakespeare last year.
You're not calling that in your wheelhouse?
There was a time when I knew more about Shakespeare than I know about Jefferson now. And I think, where did he go, that young man? Where can I find him? But that one's on Shakespeare. And so then that's the 19th through the 24th. Then on March 2nd through 8th, Steinbeck's California.
Yeah.
We did it once before with the aforementioned Russ. And he gives you, Anyway, and we're doing it again, and it's going to be magnificent. So those are coming.
But you know what? We're getting all the mail on
about France.
Yes.
France.
Yeah, I think we have a plan to do a show about France.
And there will be 2 parts to that.
You can shamelessly pitch that during that show.
Because there's never any shamelessness otherwise.
No, honestly, all joking aside, I think we got more email about the potential of going on that tour than we actually did about what the show is about.
People should send me an email. They can find me at the Jefferson Hour and tell me of their interest. But let me just say this much: there'll be it's a trip and a trip, so there'll be like 8 days: Paris, Bordeaux, Arles, Nîmes, which is where the Maison Quarré was, that was the model for the capital at Richmond, and then Aix-en-Provence. That's trip A, magnificent. I've done it before. Trip A.2 is then you stay with us for another 6 days on the Canal de Languedoc, or the Canal de Midi, the first great European canal. It connected the Mediterranean with the Atlantic by way of Bordeaux. Jefferson was on it in 1787, 10 of the greatest days of his life. I've been on it. It is the 10 greatest days of your life. This will be 6 days.
You know, the problem is we're getting all these inquiries, and we really don't have dates or costs or anything, but that's coming.
And you can go to jeffersonhour.com, and you'll see notes on all of the trips, dates, costs, and we're just pricing the French trip now, as you might expect. It's a little more complex, but that's not till October of 2019. So
a year away.
People should let me know that they want to come so I can reserve a spot for them. we're working out the least expensive possible arrangement, but we want boutique hotels, farm-to-table food.
And how many people do you suppose will go on this? Have you even thought of that?
I've been talking to travel people in Europe. It could be as many as 35. It might be we want to limit it.
Yeah,
I
you
don't
want
know
it too
because you want it
big.
to be intimate.
Right.
But on the other hand, there are so many people that want to do this. I've done it. It is paradise on earth.
Okay, so moving on. So
Everyone
this
should
week's
start
show-
learning French,
Right.
Because
And-
they don't. Yeah, do a little parlez-vous if you can.
You can't, and it's not like you'll be able to learn it on the voyage over.
The French are very friendly people. Jefferson was right. What they don't like is when you walk into a store and say, "Hey, anyone here speak English, and how much does that cost?"
Yeah, no Jefferson Hour listener.
You
would
have
do
to
that.
be civil and you have to be meek
Of course.
because you're in their country.
Of course. So moving on to what this show is about this week, so we can get to it.
Oh yeah, the letters.
You a couple of weeks
I'm
ago.
so proud of myself.
Yeah, I am too. I'm quite.
I can't believe
quite
it's
impressed. Yeah.
People are concerned about this moment in American history.
So you just to set it up. I still think you called it an alarm poll, but I might not be right.
What's your level of alarm? I
Yeah,
think I said 10
yeah.
is through the roof,
And that's
one
like
is you're not worried.
the current situation in America,
Which has gotten worse since
bombastic
since
president, and
since I
how
asked
you
for
feel
the
about
poll.
it. Yeah. So we got,
A ton of mail.
and as you cleverly pointed out, the 17 angry Democrats. We had
17 enlightened Americans. I'll tell you, I read all these letters, and there are more. These are the 17 that we were able
well,
to
they
collect.
kind of in chronological order is how we
And
approached them.
I was so impressed. First of all, we didn't get a single creepy, angry, awful letter, which you can get in these things.
Yeah, we do get those once in a while.
And everyone there was no two letters were alike. Everyone had slightly different takes on this. And most people said this, David, that Donald Trump is an expression of a moment in American history. That it's not necessarily about him per se. It's what happened that brought him to power. Congress paralyzed, the people muddled, uncertainty about the future, some significant fundamental problems of American life that no one seems to have been attending to. And so that Trump is an effervescence of a certain
Angst.
anger, rage, angst, and that he also was the luckiest man who ever ran for president because he happened to be running against someone whose negatives, Mrs. Clinton, were exceedingly high. If she had been a neuter, if she had been just person X, she might have scored better against Mr. Trump than she did. So the fact that she was a Clinton, when there is definitely some Clinton fatigue in the country, was one of the reasons I think why he was so particularly successful. Anyway, lots of people have weighed in. They're fabulous letters.
They really are, and very insightful.
And some of them made
all
me
over the
laugh out
place.
loud.
Yeah,
I mean,
you just about
Heather
lost
Ronick.
it.
I love Heather's letter.
Well, there was no disrespect in that.
No, but
you
she
just
said that
enjoyed
she
it so
said
much.
she said this buffoon has his hands on the nuclear trigger. And I just thought, wow, that's true.
Yeah.
Hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this before we go to the show. That's a serious thing, she said. Can you conceive of this president or any other initiating nuclear attack?
No.
You can't.
No.
No, some matter. People have been saying recently, as you know, as things come to put Trump into a corner, what if he responds the way he responds when things are not very severe? How will he respond when his very existential survival as the president of the United States is at stake? And there's this kind of hinting that he could do something crazy. You don't see that.
No.
You don't see that. You
No.
think the norms will hold.
Well, I don't know if I want to say the norms will hold, but he's not going to. No, I don't see that. I do not.
No
I think there's
wag the dog kind of stuff.
In the last couple of weeks, since some of these letters have been written, there's been a tremendous amount of judicial movement and people charged, people pleading guilty.
When the
I think this
National
is all gonna
Enquirer
catch up.
turns on you, you're
Yeah,
in deep
Yeah.
doo-doo.
Yeah, but he's a salesman. He's a real estate salesman. He deals with the world in that view.
And he's a reality show superstar.
As that probably more so. I don't see this leading to him destroying his family, his buildings, and the world.
I won't ask for another poll. Who believes that he's going to push the nuclear trigger?
Although that might be a good one.
But so in other words, you have a fundamental confidence and optimism that this too will pass.
What will pass specifically?
If Trump represents madness and chaos,
will America survive?
Well,
Absolutely.
of course. But I mean, and you think, in some sense, this is much ado about nothing.
Oh no, I don't think I go that far.
No, but
yeah.
So I'm trying.
You and I lived through Watergate. I got a couple years on you, but we lived through Watergate, and that was Watergate. There was no social media. There was no internet.
That was a Sunday school picnic compared to this.
Well, I don't know if it was.
But we lived
or
also
not.
through the Civil Rights Acts with hoses being turned on people and
the
attack
riots in
dogs
Chicago
and the riots
and
1968 and My Lai and Kent State.
Uh-huh.
I mean, we've lived through some actual mayhem. This is pretty low-level mayhem.
Well, I don't know that you might get argument from different people who are better informed, certainly, than me on that. But I just look back at that, and I can't help but watch news coverage because I see what's happening, and I talk to my son and say, pay attention to this. It's historically significant, and we're going to look back on this period. And in the same way that we did the 60s and what you just listed.
I just remember...
we'll get through this, and it will change, and it will go more to the center, and good will come out of it.
In the stupid board game Trivial Pursuit, which I just hate, and my daughter and mother made me play, there was a clue, and that it said how many cities were burning in their inner city in 1968 in America, and the answer was all of them.
Wow.
Think of that things were so rough then that the great cities of Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Tampa, Miami,
and
Washington, D.C., Boston were burning.
In the middle of this rural, very rural state back then.
We had our zip to zap.
And hearing all of that stuff, yeah.
And here's another one that's chilling. After the Kent State Four were killed on May 4th, 1970, I think, 71. After the killings at Kent State, there was a poll, and 56 or 7% of the American people said they had it coming. We are not in a unique moment of darkness. This country has always had its elements that are not on board with the Jeffersonian.
I'll bet there are some listening now who don't even know about Kent State.
Well, Ohio National Guard shot. 2 of the protesters were protesting. 2 of the people who were killed that day were merely walking from Class A to Class B in their normal college schedule. They were absolutely apolitical. They were just going from class to class, and they got caught in the fire. So think of it. 4 dead in Ohio. That's the famous song by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. 2 of them could not have been more innocent had they tried, and the other 2 that were killed were unarmed and shot down by the Ohio National Guard after the governor of the state of Ohio said we got to get tough with these thugs.
And today, there are still innocent civilians being killed. So,
indeed.
We're going to a dark place. I think we should go to the show.
I'm just saying that this is a critical moment in American history, and you're right to say to your son, who's in his early 20s, pay attention, because this is going to be one of the markers.
It is.
This is one of the marker moments of your life.
So what's the best about this week is it's the voice of our listeners, and I really like it. We need to do more of this.
17 of them, I have the list right here, and we want 700. Write us letters. We'll keep talking about this, and we'll post some highlights of letters. Thanks to everyone, and remember, Steinbeck in California, retreats at Loxaw Lodge in January, and worry not, we will be doing the Jefferson and France trip in October of 2019. So let me know of your interest so that I can reserve a place on the Canal de Midi for you. We will have farm-to-table goat cheese and local wines. Listen now to this special edition, listener-driven, of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson. I am joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Seated across from me now is Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Good to see you, sir.
Nice to see you, my friend David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Before we begin today, I just want to say on behalf of you and myself, our condolences to the family of John McCain, one of the giants of the United States Senate, a man who died in mid-August of 2018.
Yes, I would certainly add to that. He's a pretty amazing figure. I mean, I can think of times when he was running for president or supporting some policy in Congress where I would go, no, I just, I couldn't agree with him. But at the same time, looking back at the way he conducted himself, the facts that he based his decisions on, he was something we don't see very often. They called him a maverick. I think statesman is a bit more accurate.
Well, I didn't always agree with his policies. I didn't always understand them. But, a lot of play is being given to that moment in the campaign where a woman said, I don't think Obama is an American. He's an Arab. I can't trust him. And he checked her and said, he's a good man, a family man. And I may disagree with him in terms of policy, but I refuse to go along with that kind of bigotry. That was a great moment. But I'll tell you what I think is a better moment in John McCain's life. When the Bush administration, during the heat of the Iraq War, was trying to defend waterboarding and enhanced interrogation techniques and other forms of what any rational person would call torture, McCain stood up as a man who had been tortured repeatedly and said, look, that's not America. If we go down that path, even if it can be shown to work, we've lowered the tone of civilization, and it means that we've given permission to our enemies to engage in the same sorts of torture. We must never be a country that violates the provisions of humanity as seen in the Geneva Conventions and the UN Declaration of Rights. It is absolutely not in our interest ever to lower ourselves to the bestiality of nations that use torture as a tool.
Didn't he say that it's not who we are?
It's not who we are. And, it seems to me that when he said that, we should immediately have said, of course, that the Bush administration, the Supreme Court, all lower courts, everyone in America who thinks about good government or America's place in the world, the idea of America, should have said absolutely and amen and forgive us for ever even contemplating such a thing. So I loved it when he did that, and I think that showed a tremendous amount of the kind of statesmanship that comes from hard experience. Most of us don't know the first thing about such techniques as waterboarding or sleep deprivation or being forced to stand all night or being put in first a very hot place and then a cold place and all of the other loud music, extreme light, forcing someone to eat when they don't want to, starving people, making them eat food that violates their religious codes, all of those things.
He was in solitary confinement for 2 years, I believe.
His bones were broken and he was repeatedly tortured. And I think, this goes back to our man Jefferson. Jefferson wrote a letter to Patrick Henry during the course of the Revolutionary War in which he said, it's not in our interest to engage in acts of inhumanity, that it's in everyone's interest to humanize war to the extent that war can ever be humanized. Nobody wants war. This war was thrust upon us, but it's in our interest to bring as much humanity and dignity. These are admittedly very difficult in war, but it's in our interest to bring as much of that sense of what it is to be America and what it is to be enlightened to war as we possibly can. And that's the first letter in American history along those lines, and McCain belongs to that same tradition.
All respect to Senator McCain. A loss for the country, no matter what side of the political spectrum you
And
were
he had
on.
a farewell address that I heard read out by his former campaign manager, and it's outstanding. So you think of, we had a program recently on the farewell address of George Washington. It's
Right.
very rare for a president to give a farewell address in our time. There have only been really a handful of them in American history. And here's a senator who writes a farewell address to the American people, essentially calling for due process, harmony, respecting the other, avoiding tribalism, understanding that America has a very, very important and special significance in the world. people that don't like John McCain will find fault with the idea, the hubris of having a farewell address, but it's a beautiful one. And I think he, in his last days, realized that if he were ever going to make a statement to this country about what we should be, now was the time, and that a dying man, especially one who had achieved so much in his life, has a special status in our culture, and we actually need him to tell us things that we may have a difficult time formulating ourselves.
Well, particularly in the times we're in, which leads me into the subject of this week's show, our conversation. A couple of weeks ago, you put out a call for, I think you called it an alarm poll, didn't you?
Yes.
Could you sort of restate that for our listeners?
Well, let me try to put it in context, David. So this is the Thomas Jefferson Hour. It's about a man who lived between 1743 and 1826. It's about a Southerner, a plantation owner, a very gifted man of science and the arts, America's Renaissance man in many regards, but also, as we know, a man with some very problematic capacities and qualities. And so that's what this show is ultimately about. It's an attempt to explore and illuminate the life and achievement of the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. But my method, the method that we use here on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, is not to lock him into his world per se, but to carefully project Jefferson and the Jeffersonian outside of the date of his death in 1826 towards a world that he didn't live to see. From a historiographical or methodological point of view, that's very dicey because, of course, we don't know what Jefferson would have thought had he lived in World War I, or had he seen the Vietnam War, or had he understood waterboarding, or had he seen the race riots in Charlottesville of a year ago. We simply don't know. And it would be foolish to think that there's only one Jefferson. As we know, there are a number of different Jeffersons, and Clinton Rossiter in the 1950s, in a famous essay called "Which Jefferson Do You Quote?" said there were at least 7 distinct Jeffersons, and they could be identified, and they don't all talk harmoniously with each other. And so when we move out of the world of how many bricks at Monticello, or on what date did Jefferson send his instructions to Meriwether Lewis, or how often did Jefferson take down meteorological data, when we move away from those hard and verifiable facts into a world of, I hope, careful projection and speculation, we're entering a somewhat dangerous zone. And now you and I live at a time when the United States is in a moment of great perplexity. Is this president, who everyone listening has to agree is one of the most striking and fascinating presidents in our history, is this president in keeping somehow with American traditions? Does he represent a fundamental breach with American traditions? If so, could that in some way be seen to be healthy? What should we make of this man who has such an unusual style and does not appear to be willing to adhere to norms that we have all taken for granted, that the way that presidents speak and the way that presidents deport themselves and the kind of utterances that presidents allow to be released from their pen? So what do we make of this person? And in some moods, I think Jefferson would be absolutely appalled and grief-stricken by such a presidency. And yet Jefferson's the man who said, I like a little rebellion now and then. Jefferson believed that we do need to shake things up from time to time, and that the worst thing that can happen to a civilization is that it becomes complacent and root-bound and overly enamored of its own traditions.
Can I interject 2 things that I've heard from Jefferson that come to mind as you speak? One is, if the voters are unhappy, as he would say, vote the rascals out.
And that's got to mean something, that about 40 million Americans are so unhappy that they produce this vote.
The other is something you have said, which is we as Americans must wish every presidency to be a success.
Yes, and here's the paradox for me, because I am so intoxicated by the Jeffersonian. I've been at this for 4 decades in one way or another. In some sense, Jefferson has taken control of my life. So when I see someone like Donald Trump abusing his enemies, name-calling, saying things that are clearly lies, demonizing the press, demonizing the political opposition, demonizing anyone who is not personally loyal to the cult of Donald Trump, one part of me is just overwhelmingly chagrined and deeply saddened by this. And I think that this is maybe the worst thing that has ever happened in the whole course of my life. Another part of me wants to know if there's a payoff, and I've said this previously. If there's method to the madness, if all of this does really shatter some tired old norms and get us out from under the complacency and the malaise and the indebtedness and the gridlock of American life, if somehow there's a payoff at the other end of it where it's a storm and it's maybe a horrible hailstorm or a volcanic eruption, but somehow it releases something that purifies the American stream and we come out of it making some progress towards being more the country that we had intended to be, then I'm willing to accept that, even though I don't like the methods. But I have yet to see the payoff. I want to see the payoff. And so we asked our listeners to tell us where they are on a scale of 1 to 10. If 10 is the sky is falling, this is the end of the world as we know it. And 1 is no, this is exactly what this country needs. We asked them to weigh in, and my goodness, I have in front of me 17 thoughtful letters.
Right now, sir, we need to take a short break, but when we come back, let's begin to give our listeners a voice.
That sounds great. Let's do that.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
And welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, this special edition of the Jefferson Hour about the listener poll that we took about how alarmed people are, if alarmed, by the current presidency of the United States. And David, before we turn to these 17 letters, which I have read carefully and marked up, I want to just ask you, in the first segment you heard me saying that even though from a Jeffersonian point of view this does not look good, the Donald Trump administration and his presidency, if there is some sort of a method to the madness and a payoff down the line that is somehow redemptive of something that we value as a people, then I would reluctantly say, I wish his methods were different, but fair enough. Do you understand what I'm trying to make sense of here?
Were I asked for counsel? Or are you asking?
I'm asking you for your thoughts.
I think it's, the first lie is not so easy to tell. The first lie is difficult to tell. The second lie is much easier. And
the 4,000th, if any of that.
I'm not talking about Trump specifically.
Right.
I'm talking about ourselves as citizens.
Right.
So the first time something happens, say a disabled person is mocked.
Or Gold Star parent or whatever.
It's pretty hard to accept that. The second time it happens, it's easier. So I'm just saying something I think most people realize is this slope of acceptance at poor behavior.
There are new norms that get established,
Better
and
way
we
to
get
put
numb
it.
to it. And I do really think that Donald Trump emerges from a television reality show that was on for many years and was highly successful.
He's not a politician.
And when people used to say that, well, it's a reality TV show, I used to bristle at that. But now that he's been around for a long time, and you can get to see his ways, his approaches, his methods, it is really the case that he is being the president as if this were a live broadcasted national reality show of 4 or 8 years.
Right, and there are some people who really accept that, and they like it, and their minds are not going to be changed by any kind of behavior.
So if you go to reality shows, not just The Apprentice, but any of them, you see a level of vulgarity and name-calling and backbiting and kind of eternal dramatic chaos and keeping the attention on yourself as opposed to anybody else. And so many of those qualities are actually the reality of the Trump administration. And I don't think reality television is actually very good for us, and I certainly don't think reality presidencies are good for us, but nobody who spent any time watching The Apprentice can be very surprised by the behavior of the president as president. What surprises most of us is that he did not graduate from television into statesmanship.
I don't know why that should surprise us, but I take your point.
But we all thought, I think, that you can do whatever bombastic thing you need to do to get elected, and then the moment you're elected, somebody sits down with you and says, here's how you dress, here's how you address the Boy Scouts, here's how you christen a ship, here's how you meet ambassadors, here's how you talk to the Canadian Prime Minister.
Finished Comey's book. He was sort of taken back and shocked a bit that nobody had explained the norms and the time. But
well, perhaps they tried.
I would say one thing, though, before we start these letters, which we must. We have 3 branches of government.
The executive, the legislative, and the judicial. 2
of those aren't working. One of them is. And that gives me a lot of faith.
Which one is?
Judiciary. And you know, that I have a friend.
Checks and balances, Mr. Jefferson.
Yeah, there
Remember
you go.
John Adams?
Yeah,
Checks and balances.
He was right. I have a friend who is pretty much off the deep end as far as the you know.
I think I know him.
Yeah, you do. And I respect his opinions, but when we discuss politics, I always try to settle them down and say, if there has been wrongdoing, the courts will find it. And I think that's happening. So anyway.
Let me just say we have 17 letters here, and I want to go through the names just because we won't get to them all, but I want to thank everyone. I'm going to give you their score. So 10 is the sky is falling, and 1 is, you know what, we're just fine. In fact, this is great. Guy Schlegel gave us an 8. He's pretty alarmed. David Emery refused to vote, but he wrote a thoughtful letter. Rebecca Dupree gave us an 8. Chris Bersian, a 7. But Joshua Roy said, this was great. He said 8 if he gets a second term, but only 2 if he's a one-term president. Katie Evans gave it a 10. That was the highest level of alarm. David Grubb, a 7 or an 8. Tom Munch, maybe an 8, maybe a 3. Ken Rubin did not vote but wrote a good letter. Lon Ross, same. Heather Rondick of Wyoming, 10, another very concerned citizen. Michael Adams, 4.5. Paul Fisher, 9 or 10. Jerry Collins did not vote but wrote a good letter. Martin Miller, 3. Ron Graber, when he's upset, 7 or 8. When he's more calm, 4 or 5. and Nathan Hepner, a 7. So most of them are over 5. So most of the responses we've gotten have been on the concerned, alarmed, frightened scale.
Right.
But not all. And I like the ones that say, well, when he does something awful, it goes up to 7 or 8, and I just think the sky is falling. But then when I calm down and realize that we're going to get through this, I go back to a 5 or a 4 or a 6 or whatever. It was fascinating. And with your permission, I'd like to go through a few of the letters and give you some highlights. So here's Guy Schlegel. And remember, he was an 8. He says, I'm only quoting part of it. I can't quote all of these in their entirety, unfortunately, but they're all extraordinarily useful and interesting.
And thoughtful.
I really appreciate all of you who did this, and more I hope will respond. He says, Mr. Trump is not the only reason, although as president he seems to encourage division in his leadership role. The division has been growing steadily, I believe, since the 1960s and has reached critical mass in the last 10 or 20 years. The right has gone to the extreme right, and the left has done the same, leaving a huge universe of ideas and solutions to wither and die on the intelligence vine. So that's Guy Schlegel. That's an interesting point, that polarization is, for him, as important as the phenomenon of Trump.
It would seem from his letter that it's his rating of 8 is caused more by division than it is by anybody in the White House.
On the second page of his letter, he says, here's his alarm, unless we wake up, we are losing democracy to the highest bidder. Our so-called representatives no longer represent us, but instead the rich and big corporations, and then they lie to us and tell us that they're making America great again. Just, here he gets a little more extreme, just change the name America to Germany, and you've got Hitler. And yes, I see fascism within our own borders. So thanks to Guy Schlegel, as he says, a proud member of the 1776
Well, you should
Club.
say, too. Thanks for being a 1776 Club member, Guy.
David Emery writes to us, and let me just quote a little. I have a constant feeling of sorrow when I think about our current moment and the Trump phenomenon. I don't feel alarm, just sadness that so many of our fellow citizens are willing to tolerate dishonesty, selfishness, greed, corruption, and bombast, either because they think they'll gain by it or actively delight in the idea that Trump's behavior inflicts pain on liberals, minorities, and the rest of the world. I agree completely that it's important to be able to disagree with people about politics and other matters while still being friends. But when one side's arguments are founded on hatred, resentment, and amorality, there's very little room for compromise. Good letter.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now to Rebecca Dupree. And remember, Rebecca gave it an 8, David.
Mm-hmm.
I would put my level of concern, writes Rebecca, at around 8. Donald Trump's presidency is a symptom of the much larger problem of the division in this nation. The root of this division is that the Civil War never really ended. It only went from a hot war to a cold war. The Union destroyed the South's ability to fight, but not its will to fight. The Confederacy was never really philosophically discredited. When President Obama was elected, it triggered a backlash from the philosophical contemporaries of the South. It was this backlash that led to Trump's election. Interesting. You know, we've heard Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein saying again and again over the last 6 months, we are now in a cold civil war.
Mm-hmm.
That this is civil war.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe a cold war, whether we haven't had too many violent incidents, but we are in a cold civil war, and Rebecca Dupree would appear to agree with that. Then she says on the next page of her good letter, the thing that gives me hope is, ironically enough, the apathy of the average person. As long as there's food in the fridge, a football game on TV, and
she's
video
been
games
listening
to play,
to you.
The great majority of the American people could care less about current events. Furthermore, most would not survive more than a couple of days of inconvenience of not having internet access. The idea that they will take up arms is laughable.
That's a bit
That's
brutal.
like Jenkinsonian pessimism crept
I
in.
do hear echoes of you in there, yeah.
Chris Bersian, I hope that's right, Bersian, he gave this a 7. This in regards to your panic scale you mentioned in the podcast. I believe that the Constitution will ultimately prevail, but the complicity of the Congress makes the number much higher than it should be. If anything, the actions of Congress or lack thereof disappoint me more than anything the president may or may not be doing. Interesting. So lots of people are Jeffersonians in this sense, David. They're saying Trump is a symptom, not the source. That something about America propelled him into power.
If Jefferson were to magically appear, well, he could. Actually.
He could suit up.
He would look at what Congress is doing right now and say, what?
And say, you were meant to check and balance. You're the sovereign. The presidency is second in the scale of sovereignty. The judiciary third, but the primary branch of government is the legislative,
representing the people.
And you should make sure that you don't let any of the other two branches ever run away with the country. Mm-hmm. You should assert your sovereignty.
Mm-hmm. So I agree with his point.
Here's Joshua Roy. He gave an 8 if the president gets 2 terms and only a 2 if he has 1. He says, I think his legacy will generally be favorable, providing he doesn't do anything disastrous in the next 2 years. I think he has shown that presidents are supposed also to be leaders, not just puppets to the highest donors. He is doing what he believes, for better or worse, and that is also a good quality, I think. We can vote him out in 2 years if we want to. I don't think that Trump is a great leader, but I think he is a good leader, even though he's highly flawed. So I think a number of these letters say, look, we needed this. They accept his narrative that the establishment was root bound, that the deep state is not attending to the people's business, that there are forgotten Americans in this country, and that we needed somebody to come in and just to shake that tree and make a lot of things happen that disrupt the norms of American life. Because what were the norms bringing us? They were bringing us greater indebtedness, paralysis in Congress, and so on and so forth.
He also says, I would like more of him mixed with more of Jefferson in the future. Good luck on that.
Yeah, good luck on that.
He says, someone who is decisive and willing to take risks if need be, but who has done their homework and is well read. Like you said a few months ago, we want him to succeed. We need him to succeed just like we want all presidents to succeed. So somebody heard you.
Katie Evans writes, and Katie Evans gave this a 10. I'm watchful and worried. I am stirred to do more than I've ever done before. I've written a note of welcome and love to a local mosque. I've marched in the streets for women's rights, and I've marched multiple times to draw attention to the need to change how we regard a Confederate monument in our town square. I've made calls to a Senate candidate. I voted early in every election in my county this year, and I've engaged my city council members more than I ever have in my life.
Bravo.
That's what one thing that this presidency has done. It has empowered and engaged and reawakened a whole number of American constituencies that were largely complacent. And I think Trump would say that's good. Even though he might disagree with what he's awakened, I think he would say that's the point.
Well, Jefferson would definitely say it's good, yeah.
She says, I think it's a she, I'm watchful and worried, but my hope for the long game is that this era of post-fact malarkey is going to rouse a whole lot of us like we haven't been aroused since the 1960s. I'm a librarian. I'm, in fact, anti-partisan, and I do not abide malarkey. I love the word malarkey.
Thank you.
To Dan Grubb. Grubb gave this a 7 or 8. He says of Trump, he's a corrupt toddler. But the system has held, and the courts have managed to prevent most of Trump's damage. The worst impact from Trump is the winking and nodding at white supremacists that normalizes them. I live in Richmond, Virginia, the city of Confederate statues, locals who want them removed, and out-of-towners who show up every weekend with rifles on their backs to wave rebel flags. And I can tell you, it was not like this 3 years ago. You'd have the same one or two guys waving the stars and bars downtown, but not people coming in from Tennessee and Georgia and wherever else. And definitely nothing like what happened in Charlottesville. Did racism exist? Obviously. But at least people felt the need to keep it a secret. That has gone away under Trump. That goes back to Joseph Ellis saying, we used to play our racism with the card down.
Now we
play it with the card up.
Face up.
Great
right.
letter. Thank you very much to Dan Grubb. David Tom Munch writes us, and he gave it I think an 8 or a 3. Yes, 8 depending on his mood. He says, when I let myself get worked up, I would call it an 8. But when I look at the big picture, it shrinks to a 3. I'm concerned about the effect this has on the general populace, and especially the effect on the earth and our fellow animals. But I like it that it has people asking the big questions and looking at our human condition in exquisite relief.
You know, that's a great answer to Dan Grubb, too, is it? You talked about the cold Civil War, and we're being forced to face some things as a nation, as a people, and that's good.
Yes. And I want to go back to read the Trump narrative in the most generous possible way. Think of how much the country has felt adrift and unable to face questions of energy policy or educational policy or the problem of immigration or Islamic terrorism and so on. There's been a sense for many, many years that not much is getting done, not much is getting addressed, that somehow we're not being a dynamic nation in a world where China is dynamic and Argentina is dynamic and India is dynamic and so on. And so I think Mr. Trump looked at this world and said, I can do better than that. I can shake this thing out of its complacency and bring people into a sense that this is an emergency that must be addressed. So far, so good. Now, whether he has brought the right methodology and message to that shakeup is another question. But a lot of our readers are saying his shaking things up is not the worst thing that could happen to this country.
There will be damage. People will be hurt.
There are bodies.
Yep.
Ken Rubin, who gave no numerical vote, says this. Now, this brings us to Donald Trump. Certainly not a perfect man, far from it. But what I see is someone who is willing to move the ship from its present course to a course involving more personal responsibility, where one can benefit from his/her labor, and if necessary, suffer the consequences of his/her failure. Should the government really fund 18 months of unemployment payments to an able-bodied citizen? Does the government really need to have 11 million employees? To me, this election was not only about the wall or tax cuts or Obamacare or about NAFTA or even aid to Israel. It was about changing the direction of the pendulum so that the people that toil, people that really work and sweat in the pit, can lift themselves up and thrive for their own benefit and the benefit of their families.
There were a couple of lines in his letter that you sort of skipped over that I thought were very interesting. He brought up the fact that John Quincy Adams spoke 8 languages, was quite a diplomat. And then there was Andrew Jackson, and people thought much differently about him. But as he asks, who was the most successful and memorable president?
Well, no question. John Quincy Adams was one of the most talented and best prepared individuals who ever served as president of the United States. He did not have a successful presidency. He served for a single term, as did his famous father, John Adams. And in historical surveys, Jackson is now infinitely better regarded than John Quincy Adams. So the point is, it's not about whether you're a genius, a linguist, and a professional international diplomat. It's about what you bring to the actual office of the presidency.
Many more letters to read, and we'll get to them, but right now we need to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson, just sneaking in a little announcement between segments of the Jefferson Hour. I want you to join me this winter at Locksaw Lodge, west of Missoula, for 2 humanities cultural retreats. The first one, Water in the West, January 13th through 18th, and the second, Shakespeare Without Tears, January 19th through 24th. For more information, go to our website, jeffersonhour.com/tours. We'll see you in the mountains.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. This week, we are giving voice to our many listeners, particularly those who responded to your call, Clay, for I think you called it an alarm poll. You wanted to know how alarmed people were at the current state of affairs in America. And we got many, many letters, and we have 17 that you've picked out and reviewed.
On a scale of 1 to 10, the question is the sky falling and this is the 7th seal being opened? That's 10. Or do we give it a 1 and Donald Trump is one of the better things that's happened to this country? I like it that many people rejected such a simplistic numerical poll and said,
I'm
going to write something, but I'm not necessarily...
It's not really a poll, but it was a way to get people to respond.
We've never had this much response. I hope more people will write the essays or letters of this sort. They've been very interesting and helpful, and that's why we're devoting this entire program to trying to get through as many as we can. Let me go on. Lon Ross refused to give a number, but he says this: the concern over Donald Trump is misguided. The real problem is Congress and the citizenry. Congress is so deeply divided that they are unable to do the people's business. Despite what party is in the majority or in the White House, they fight and bicker. The executive branch seizes the opportunity to take a little more power. The citizenry, so hungry for leadership, progress, and change, provide their consent. This happens no matter who holds office. We are left with an unequal separation of powers.
That's great.
But look at this too. This is about, remember, I think I said when I brought this up, maybe you like his policies but not his personality. And here's what Lon Ross has to say about that. Strip away Donald Trump's unfiltered tweets, excessive bullying, and vulgarisms, and objectively look at his record thus far. It does not appear to be any more or less remarkable than any previous president. Certainly his methods are different, but this does not make them inherently wrong. There is still no wall, no coherent health care plan, no reform of social services. Like all presidents, he talks a big game, but ultimately is unable to deliver. But keep in mind that the system is not necessarily set up to allow any president to implement his or her agenda to match what he has promised. Good letter.
And then we go to Heather Ronick.
Dear Mr. Jenkinson, regarding the danger of the current presidency, my concern level is definitely a 10, the greatest possible level. First, a man with apparently poor impulse control and a tendency to lash out at enemies has access to our country's nuclear weapons.
How can you laugh at
because
that?
You never really, we don't really think about that, do you?
Well,
you think Uzi attacked.
It's a little gallows humor. Is that what we're at?
It's just that you realize suddenly that we're caught in this farcical national reality television program, and he has his hands on the nuclear trigger, and he could invade Korea. Second, the president and his EPA show a reckless disregard for the only planet on which we humans can currently live at what is believed to be a precarious time in its history. They even show a disregard for and proud ignorance of science itself.
Mr. Jefferson would not be happy about that.
Third, I am worried about the continued erosion of democratic rights and the rule of law in this country, including voter suppression, abuse of pardon power, mass incarceration, civil asset forfeiture, forced arbitration, gerrymandering, and sweeping executive orders. On your recommendation, I read How Democracies Die. Unfortunately, the current president took office at a time when presidential powers are expansive and the system is dependent on the president being a man of strong moral fiber. Then finally, in this lovely letter, I just love Heather Ronick from Mountain View, Wyoming. He has truly shamed the office of the presidency and has many, many equally shameless cronies. I have no doubt that Thomas Jefferson would weep if he were alive. So please put me in the, quote, madness, darkness, and national collapse camp. I'm supposed to be weeping and I'm laughing. Heather, I don't mean it. It's just that it's so absurd to think that a person who would go out of his way to attack person X, like to get involved in an NFL football controversy, also has his fingers on the nuclear trigger. Think of that, David.
I am beginning to think of it, as you stated earlier, as a reality show.
It's like it's an episode of All-Star Wrestling, but there are nuclear triggers right out on the announcer's desk.
Mm-hmm.
That was a great letter. Thank you. Michael Adams gives it a 4.5. On the one hand, the political status quo has been quo long enough to have lost its status. There's a sentence worthy of Eric Severide. I think it's healthy that we choose a non-politician who promised to cut through some of the, for lack of a better term, institutional silliness that has accrued over the past several decades and refocus our political attention on actual needs rather than games. This is a change we were increasingly in need of. And then he goes on to say, unfortunately, the person willing to step up and make that promise was Donald Trump, whose many flaws have likely filled your inbox to overflowing. I dislike how his crassness and uncivility seem to have incited worse in public fora. I think he means public arenas. And I am heartsick that we would have elected someone with his particular character flaws.
And then on to Paul Fisher.
Paul Fisher gave this a 9/10. It seems that much of this is driven by a deeper problem, the rejection of reason and fact-based argument in favor of blind acceptance of conspiracy theories. I agree with that the assault on reason, which Jefferson said was our only oracle, and on science, David, is a very difficult problem. He says, I was for many decades a conservative Republican, but while I voted for a few Democrats over the years, I left the Republican Party in disgust after the nomination of Donald Trump.
I enjoyed his quote from Carl Sagan at the end of his letter from Sagan's book, The Demon-Haunted World. He writes, quote, if we can't think for ourselves, if we're unwilling to question authority, then we're just putty in the hands of those in power. Obviously, but good to state it.
And then a little Jeffersonian part of the same Sagan quote, but if the citizens are educated and form their own opinions, then those in power work for us. In every country, we should be teaching our children the scientific method and the reasons for a Bill of Rights. That's a great quotation from the late Carl Sagan, whom I met, by the way, at the White House once, and it's from our friend Paul Fisher, who gives this a 9/10 on the alarm, the sky is falling scale.
And then we're on to Jerry Collins.
Jerry Collins declined to give it a numerical assessment, but he says, my being jubilant is associated with the entrenchment of a governing class that needs to be desperately dispersed and replaced, and from which our citizenry needs deliverance. Breaking up that juggernaut requires our current POTUS, who has a unique adeptness for this work. Mm-hmm. P.S. I really like you guys and this program.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry.
We need that, Jerry. Then we go to Martin Miller.
Yes, Martin Miller says, good evening, dear Citizen Clay. The TJ Hour podcast has been a treasured part in my week for years. I'm glad there are people like yourself who have dedicated their lives to preserving the complex legacy of our nation's founding. I took your challenge. He says, before I continue...
But he says, following your Thoreau episode.
Yeah, so as you know, Thoreau, in my view, is the author of the greatest American book, Walden.
But he did a good thing. He talks about found out that not turning on the TV out of habit and reading more led to a more productive and satisfying life.
Yes, Thoreau's great challenge to learn to live deliberately,
Blow up your TV.
to front only the essential facts of life. And then he says, before I continue, let me say I believe Donald Trump is a petulant con artist, but to answer your question on a scale of 1 to 10, my concern is a 3. I think the way you ask the question might cloud the meaning. He says, here's what the poll should really do. 10, people who think that we are on the edge of madness, darkness, and national collapse. Did I really say that? Must have.
I don't know.
1, people who say, thank God Almighty, we're going to be saved because of Donald Trump. Finally, someone is standing up. And then he says, number 3, people who like Trump's policies but don't like his personality. With a few exceptions, I fall into this category. I was a never Trumper during the primaries, but just like thousands of Bernie Sanders voters, I held my nose and voted for what I thought was the lesser of two evils in general. I think the risk is not of Trump shattering civil norms, but of the pendulum going too far on the left during the counterswing which will follow. Interesting.
Well, he's probably got a point. It's things are going to change a lot. I would like to think, optimistically, that we're going to look back at. We talked this week about the passing of John McCain, and there was a time when you would really get upset because of some position he had taken or people who were talking against him. That all looks pretty mild now.
I'm hoping for a radical return to the center, aren't you?
Yeah. All the normal rules have changed, so it may be easier. I'd like optimistically to think that it's going to be easier for us to find consensus after we get out of this period of no consensus.
It would be interesting.
Am I being naive with that?
Yes, you are. I think that.
Well, thank you for that.
I think that it's going to be so hard for us to pull back, so that you see that take Mrs. Clinton out of the picture.
Uh-huh.
You had Donald Trump, I suppose, on the right, on the populist right, and you had Bernie Sanders on the populist left.
Uh-huh.
In my opinion, Bernie Sanders' ideas for universally paid for health care and universally paid for higher ed are unsustainable. And I think that Donald Trump's outrageous demonizing of people of color.
Yeah, you're going to get some mail on that. Address it to Clay.
Yeah, but I feel that this is true, that we were given, leaving Mrs. Clinton out of it for a moment, that was more about personality than politics. That was more about the Clinton legacy than anything else.
Yep.
But if you have Bernie Sanders on the left and you have Donald Trump on the right,
there's a lot of room
in my
in the
opinion,
middle.
that excludes about 75% of this country. I would like better funding for higher ed. I would like a universal Medicare for all situation, single payer. I would also like people to take more responsibility for their lives. I do think that certain parts of political correctness are really damaging this country. I do think that immigration is an issue, and I think that Islamic terrorism and the Islamic affront to the West has to be addressed, and it wasn't, I don't think, responsibly addressed by the last president of the United States. So I'm like everyone else. I'm in the middle. I see some benefits on both edges of the spectrum, but I don't want either of them to prevail. And I want civility and what John McCain said in his last statement to the American people, that we need to go back to regular orders in which the two sides realizing they're really trying to get to something like the same outcome, but with different ideologies and different methodologies. And we need to embrace that which we all share more and be less absolutist about those things that we don't share.
But if you were in the position the United States is in, what country in the world has a better chance to survive it and get there?
Well, that's a point that a number of people are making in these letters, that you have a nation of 1/3 of a billion people. We're going to be just fine. People take care of their families for the most part. People go on vacations in the national parks. People watch some television, but they also read books. They love this country. They are the strength of this country, and our government is not the country. Our government is the government, and that the people of America are better, more solid, more reliable, more self-sufficient than we give them credit for. And our obsession with government, which has been fed with kerosene by Donald Trump. He's the most talked about president in modern history, that this is not good for us, that we're taking the bait and forgetting that America is on the whole just fine, and that the strength of the people is what's going to redeem all of this, and we need to stop allowing ourselves to be, in a kind of superficial way, addicted to the nonsense and get back to what it is to be an American.
You're saying America on the whole is just fine, and I think I know what you mean, and I think I agree with you. You want to expound on that a bit?
Well, there are many significant problems, and
Yes.
for me, let me just list a few. The status and treatment of American Indians in our national culture is, I think, one of the wounds that need to be addressed in a thoughtful and earnest way, and I know you agree with that.
It's almost like immigration in a different form.
The problem of the poorest Americans, there are millions of them. They're often women raising children alone.
And how can that be in a country with our wealth?
We don't have living wages. We have nothing like wages that are equal to the cost of living. Housing is increasingly difficult for people to find in something like an affordable way. And if you look at the statistics, which I looked up this weekend, David, it is now the case, listen to this, that 20 individuals, 20, own 50% of America. That's the number of people that would fit in a school bus. 20 own half of the wealth of this country.
And Jefferson would have something to say about that.
And he did in France. He said, you let that trigger get to about that point, and you're going to have pitchforks and guillotines in the streets.
We're almost out of time. We have a couple more. Can we get through
quickly.
this?
Ron Graber.
Right.
But when I look at the people in the communities where I work and live who give generously to help others, I see kindness and decency, not just in my friends and family, but in other people, important people who wield power in our nation and across the globe. For that reason, my number is only a 4 or 5. That's what I was just talking about.
That's what we're just talking about, right? And then lastly, Nathan Hepner, who we've heard from before.
He says, my concern scale is 7, but our system is resilient, and I still believe that the rule of law and reason will prevail. However, the reality that, 1, our leadership is either actively enjoying the opportunity of engaging in childishness, hate, and self-centered opportunism at every turn, or is too cowardly to resist it, and 2, that a large part of the electorate seems to think this is okay, all that really leaves me with grave concerns for our future. Leadership, climate, and example mean a lot. We will become what we insist on honoring. And I should say that as a close to the John McCain news of his death this last week. We will become what we insist on honoring.
And I'll repeat that. Leadership, climate, and example mean a lot. We will become what we insist on honoring. Excellent. Thank you, Nathan Hepner. And thanks to all of you who took the time to respond to Clay's alarm poll, how you feel about the current state of things in the United States. And thank you all for listening. If you'd like to respond to this, please go to jeffersonhour.com, and you can ask President Jefferson or Mr. Jenkinson a question. And while you're there, you can consider supporting the show. We do so appreciate it. And once again, thank you for responding, all of those of you who wrote in.
And I hope that we have fairly represented your letters. We couldn't read them in their entirety, of course, but we did read them ourselves. And they really have deeply moved and pleased me, David. 17 letters, and that's just part of what we got.
Right.
All well stated, thoughtfully argued, people taking seriously that this is a critical moment in our national destiny. A lot of optimism and some pessimism, but everyone rejected the idea of simply giving us a grade and instead tried to analyze to their best ability where we think we are.
Sir, we are out of time for this week. We've missed your essay, and we will catch up with that.
For once, I'm ahead of the game. Now I have one in the can. It was actually about this very set of issues, so we'll come to it in another show. Thank you. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views.
President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.